Check your banking app right now. That number decides where you live, what's in your fridge tonight, and that flicker of dread every time a waiter walks toward your table with the bill. Now erase it. Erase the bank, the coins, every price tag that number depends on. Go back 34,000 years to a world with no writing, no farming, no money anywhere on Earth. And you will still find rich people. In a river valley in what's now Russia, 2 children were buried side by side, wrapped in more than 10,000 carved ivory beads. Years of skilled labor on 2 kids too young to have earned any of it. So how does a child end up buried like royalty, 40,000 years before royalty existed? Being rich never actually required money. Money was just the scorekeeping, invented later. And the uncomfortable part is what that says about you. Start with the obvious question. Before coins, before grain stores, before anyone had a word for property, what did being rich even mean? Almost certainly, it meant food. Specifically, reliable access to fat and protein, in a world where both were desperately unpredictable. A skilled hunter with a good season didn't just eat well. He controlled something everyone else needed, which is the oldest definition of power there is. In lean months, when a hunt failed for weeks at a stretch, the difference between a family with stored fat reserves and a family without one wasn't comfort. It was survival. Hunger was the real predator in that world. Patient, indifferent, and always circling. Wealth was simply whatever kept it at a distance a little longer than it kept your neighbor at a distance. And food wasn't the only kind of wealth. Long before farming, some hunter-gatherer groups were already trading in prestige goods. Seashells carried hundreds of miles inland, chunks of red ochre, polished stone, amber from coastlines some of these people would never see with their own eyes. None of it was useful for survival in any practical sense. You can't eat a shell bead. What it did was signal something. This person, or this family, has reach. Connections. Access to a network most people in the group would never touch. That's still roughly how a Rolex works, minus the walking. Archaeologists can actually see the food gap in bone. Chemical signatures locked into tooth enamel and rib reveal what a person ate for years at a time. More meat, more marine protein, a steadier diet overall. The richest hunters at some sites got the fatty cuts, the marrow, the organ meat packed with calories. Everyone else got the lean muscle, tougher to chew and far poorer in the fat a body needed to survive an ice age. In some ancient burial populations, those richer chemical signatures cluster suspiciously close to the graves with the most decoration, the most tools, the most jewelry. None of it required a receipt. Somehow, everyone still remembered exactly who ate what. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind. For decades, the popular story about early humans was that hunter-gatherer life was basically equal. Share the meat, share the risk, no one hoards, no one starves alone. So where does a grave like that one in Russia fit into a story about equality? For a long time, most researchers assumed real inequality only showed up after agriculture. Once people started owning land, storing grain, and handing farms down to their children. Foragers, the thinking went, moved too often and depended on each other too much to let anyone get that far ahead. Then sites like Sungir kept getting excavated, and the assumption started to crack. Sungir is roughly 34,000 years old, deep in the Ice Age, tens of thousands of years before the first seed was ever planted. Alongside the beads, those 2 children were buried with pierced fox teeth, carved ivory ornaments, and long ivory spears too straight and too fragile to have ever been used for actual hunting. Objects made purely to be buried, not used. The evidence there doesn't read like isolated generosity toward 2 unlucky kids. Many bioarchaeologists now interpret it as inherited status. Wealth and standing passed down to children who hadn't done anything yet to deserve it, simply because of the family they were born into. And Sungir wasn't a one-time fluke. Skip forward roughly 30,000 years, to a cemetery in modern-day Bulgaria called Varna. There, in a grave dated to around 4,600 BCE, archaeologists found a single man buried with more worked gold than has been recovered from anywhere else on Earth from that same time period, combined. A gold-covered scepter. Gold rings stacked up his arms. This was before writing reached the region, before the wheel, more than 1,000 years before anything resembling a pyramid. Whatever this man did, or whoever his family was, the gap between his grave and the graves around him wasn't subtle. It was the size of a fortune, buried in dirt, on purpose. It's a strange thing to sit with. You'll spend 20 minutes in a store deciding between 2 nearly identical bottles of shampoo, agonizing over pennies. Meanwhile, somewhere in deep prehistory, a toddler was buried holding more wealth, by weight, than most people in that valley would see across an entire lifetime. Being rich, it turns out, has never needed to make sense to the person receiving it. There's a piece of this story most people have never heard, and it's not about beads or gold at all. It's about teeth. When a child goes through real hunger or illness, the body actually pauses tooth enamel growth for a few weeks while it deals with the crisis. That pause leaves a permanent groove in the tooth, a kind of scar that lasts for the rest of that person's life. Bioarchaeologists call it enamel hypoplasia, and in burial sites where some graves are stacked with goods and others are nearly empty, the pattern shows up exactly where you'd expect. The poorer graves tend to carry more of these grooves. Being unwealthy, even tens of thousands of years ago, wasn't just a difference in decoration. It was written into the body itself. Here's where it gets interesting, because whatever inequality existed before farming was mild compared to what came after it. In 2017, a team led by archaeologist Tim Kohler pulled together house-sized data from hundreds of ancient settlements around the world, using the size of a person's home as a rough stand-in for how much they owned. The same trick modern economists use with income to measure inequality today. The pattern was stark. Once people started farming, and especially once they started plowing fields with animals instead of hand tools, wealth stopped resetting every generation. Land could be inherited. Herds could be inherited. Societies with plow agriculture and large domesticated animals, mostly across Europe and Asia, ended up with far steeper wealth gaps than farming societies in the Americas, where there were no horses or oxen to hitch to a plow. The tool mattered nearly as much as the idea. For the first time, a family could get richer simply by staying rich. You might recognize the shape of that. Today, it just goes by a different name, a trust fund. You can see the same basic shape almost anywhere you look after that. Royal tombs in early Egypt, stacked with imported lapis lazuli, carried 1,000 miles by hand. Shang Dynasty graves in China, lined with bronze and carved jade. Chiefs across the Pacific Islands, buried in feathered cloaks that took an entire lifetime to weave, one bird at a time. Different continents, different centuries, the same story, over and over. We like to imagine our ancestors as more equal than us, sharing meat around a single fire, no one keeping score. Some of them were. But the moment humans figured out how to hold on to more than they could eat in a season and pass it to a child who hadn't earned it, they built the machine that still runs your bank account today. We just changed its fuel a few times since. Here's the part almost nobody tells you, and it's the strangest reveal in this whole story. Being rich in the ancient world didn't only mean eating better or being buried better. Evidence suggests it meant a real advantage in who got to have children, and whose children survived long enough to have children of their own. It lines up with something simple. Wealth meant better nutrition, which meant healthier children. It meant enough resources to support more than one partner or household in some societies. It meant surviving a bad harvest that could quietly wipe out a poorer neighbor's entire family. Wealth didn't just buy comfort. It bought a longer, wider branch on the family tree. Population geneticists studying deep patterns in the Y chromosome have proposed something unsettling. Around the time property, inheritance, and powerful family lines became common, the number of distinct male lineages contributing to future generations appears to shrink sharply. Not because most men vanished, but because a smaller number of wealthy, powerful lineages ended up fathering a wildly disproportionate share of everyone who came after. In other words, a meaningful share of the people alive on Earth right now may exist, in part because a specific handful of families were rich enough, or well-fed enough, or powerful enough, thousands of years ago, to outsurvive and outreproduce almost everyone around them. Your existence might not be pure chance. It might be a faint, distant echo of somebody's inheritance. So here's the answer to where this started. Nobody handed those two children in Russia 10,000 ivory beads because of anything they had done. Somebody handed it to them because of the family they were born into, and the wealth that family had already built before either child could walk. That isn't really a story about the Ice Age. It's a story about inheritance. And inheritance is still the operating system running underneath almost everything you own. It's there in a down payment covered by a parent instead of a decade of saving. It's there in a college fund started the day someone was born, quietly growing while they were still learning to walk. It's the same basic shape as 10,000 ivory beads, just quieter, wrapped in paperwork instead of mammoth tusk. And you're still doing a smaller version of it, every single day. You're mildly annoyed by a delayed paycheck. You're mildly annoyed by a landlord raising the rent by $40. You're mildly annoyed by a coworker who somehow always gets the good shifts, the good bonus, the good luck. None of it feels ancient. All of it is. That number sitting in your banking app isn't a modern invention. It's just the newest shape of something that has been sorting humans into two groups since before humans had a word for either one. Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, someone was buried holding everything, and someone else was buried holding nothing at all. You are still standing somewhere on that same line.